One of the hardest decisions a captain might ever have to make is whether or not to order an evacuation of their ship. In 1904, after the SS Clallam began taking on water in a heavy storm in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Captain George Roberts panicked and hastily ordered an evacuation. 3 of his ship's lifeboats were hastily loaded and lowered into the violent sea. Within minutes, all 3 boats capsized, spilling everyone into the water. The ordeal killed nearly everyone in the boats, including every woman and child on board. The Clallam proved more seaworthy than originally thought, remaining afloat for hours, long enough for most of those still on board to be rescued, including Captain Roberts. The tragedy became a cautionary tale of what could happen if a captain reacted to an emergency in haste and sends his passengers away too quickly. This lesson would prove deadly for the SS Princess Sophia a little over a decade later. In 1891, the Canadian Pacific Railway began building a fleet of Pacific steamships connecting Vancouver, British Columbia with Asia and Australia. To further cement their market dominance, the company established a steamship line on the west coast of Canada and Alaska, running along what's known as the Inside Passage. Navigation in the area was challenging, and Canadian Pacific almost immediately lost one of their first liners on the route, called the Islander, when the 1,500-ton vessel struck an iceberg off Douglas Island in Alaska and sank within 20 minutes, killing over 40 people. To better match the rough conditions and gain an edge in the competitive market, the line began modernizing its West Coast fleet in 1907 and ordered 9 new vessels over the years leading up to the outbreak of World War I. These included the new coastal liner SS Princess Sophia. While these vessels were designed to withstand harsh weather conditions if needed, coastal liners were designed to sail within 50 miles of land. She was constructed by Bow McLaughlin and Company in Paisley, Scotland. The 2,320-ton vessel was designed to hold up to the harsh Pacific Northwest weather, and she was equipped with many modern safety features, including a double hull and a wireless communication set. She carried 8 steel lifeboats, 1 wooden workboat, and 6 life rafts. She was also equipped with 548 life preservers, 20 of which were child-sized. Her accommodations were comfortable and included a forward observation lounge, a social hall, and a 112-seat dining saloon with large windows. She had a single triple expansion steam engine that could achieve a respectable 14-knot service speed. She was designed to service the more northern British Columbia and Alaska routes in the summer and the Victoria-Vancouver routes during the winter freeze. The Princess Sophia was launched on November 8, 1911, and after she was completed in 1912, she sailed the long voyage around Cape Horn to her new home in British Columbia. On June 7, 1912, she sailed her maiden voyage and soon took up her regular route between Victoria and Skagway, Alaska, along with her running mate, the Princess May. At the outset of World War I, the Princess Sophia was requisitioned to serve the war effort. She carried some of the first troops from Western Canada to the war in Europe. Though she wouldn't survive the war, she would soon return to passenger service. I think I'm fascinated by stories like the Princess Sophia because I grew up nearby in the Pacific Northwest. While I sadly don't live in the area anymore, certain scents like cedar and oak immediately reconnect me with that nostalgic feeling of home. That's why I'm so excited to be partnering with Scentbird on this video. There's nothing quite like finding that perfect scent to match your personality and leave a good impression on the people around you. I get really overwhelmed by the fragrance section at the store. After spraying a couple of different scents, they all start smelling the same to me, and I can never really tell which one works. That's why I love Scentbird. They've made the process of finding your perfect fragrance easy and enjoyable. Each month, Scentbird lets you choose a new designer fragrance for just $17. They have a huge variety of colognes, perfumes, and unisex options to choose from. And they send you a 30-day supply, so you have plenty of time to decide if you like a fragrance before committing to a full-size bottle. Scentbird also offers a simple quiz where you can put in your preferences and find a fragrance you will love. It's a great way to sample well-known designer fragrances and discover cool new niche brands. This month I received Electric Wood by Room 1015, Mountain by Joseph Aboud, and North Atlantic Right Whale by Sanctuary. North Atlantic Right Whale was the most different from the fragrances I would normally go for. but I love the Queen aquatic scent with notes of mandarin, white patchouli, and musk. Mountain was closer to the woodsy colognes that I love. It has this great nostalgic cedar scent mixed with peppercorn and bright citrusy notes of grapefruit and lemon. But my favorite of the three has to be Electric Wood. This one has that perfect mix of cedar, oak wood, and nutmeg that immediately transport me to the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It's a perfect fragrance that subtly tells people a little bit about who I am. I love that. Make sure to use my code BOBOATS for 55% off your first month at Scentbird. That's just a little over $7 for your first month. I'm confident you'll love it. Alright, back to the Princess Sophia. By 1918, Princess Sophia was commanded by Captain Leonard P. Locke, a 66-year-old veteran of the sea who began his career at the age of 16. Captain Locke was considered one of the most experienced navigators on the West Coast at the time. Though he was known as a strict captain who ran a tight ship, he also had a softer side and enjoyed reading and writing poetry. He was particularly fond of the poet Robert W. Service. As the season came to a close, the captains of the Canadian Pacific Navigation Company were under immense pressure. On October 13th, one of the larger vessels in the Princess fleet, the Princess Adelaide, ran aground between Victoria and Vancouver. No one was injured in the accident, but the vessel was pulled from service for extensive repairs, leaving the remaining fleet with no alternate passenger vessels to fill in if there were any additional disruptions in service. Captain Locke was explicitly warned to keep his vessel out of trouble that winter, and he likely felt pressure to keep his liner on schedule. On Saturday, October 19, 1918, the Princess Sophia left Vancouver on her last northern run of the year. When she docked at Prince Rupert, steward Joseph Woosnan became ill with influenza and had to leave the ship. He was admitted to the hospital and recovered just a few days later. The Spanish flu ironically saved the young steward's life. The Princess Sophia arrived in Juneau late on October 22nd and reached her northernmost destination in Skagway the following afternoon. Winter was already setting in, and the Sophia was one of the final opportunities to leave the northern city before the freeze set in. People crowded the docks, eager to head south. She was scheduled to leave at 7 p.m., but the loading of passengers and freight took longer than expected, and she wasn't able to leave until just after 10 p.m. on October 23rd. She carried 75 crew and 278 passengers. They represented a cross-section of humanity. Oscar Poppert and his twin brother Walter were hoping to strike gold in the Alaskan interior. The two saved up enough money to head south for the winter. Walter booked passage on the Prince Rupert, but Oscar managed to get a first-class ticket on the Princess Sophia. The two parted at Skagway, planning to reunite at the Diller Hotel in Seattle. Florence Beaton's husband struck gold in the Iditarod district of Alaska. She was the first European woman to arrive there in 1909. Now she was traveling south with her two children, while her husband stayed behind to tend to his claim. Lulu Mae Johnson was a dance hall performer and hotelier in Dawson City, Yukon. She married her employer, Murray S. Eads, in 1904, and in 1918, the couple sold their business and were heading south to start their next venture. The gold rush was long over by this time, and the economy it fueled was winding down. Many of the Sophia's passengers were leaving the area in search of opportunities elsewhere, with no plans to return in the spring. In 1900, Skagway's population was just over 3,000 people, but by 1918, the town's population shrank to just around 500. Just about everyone in the area knew someone on board the Sophia. As she sailed away, many well-wishers crowded the wharf to see her off, one of their last links to the outside world before the harsh Alaska winter descended. As the Sophia steamed south on the main channel, conditions rapidly deteriorated. With the poor visibility, Captain Locke depended on a method of navigation called dead reckoning. This imperfect method typically used a device towed behind the ship that would measure the distance traveled from a fixed point to calculate the ship's position. While this practice was common at the time, it required precise calculations, and it was difficult to account for weather conditions and currents. While what exactly took place in her wheelhouse is unknown, it seems that despite the reduced visibility, Captain Locke kept her sailing at or near her full speed, eager to arrive in Vancouver on time. At some point, either he or his first officer Jerry Shaw made a navigation error as they traversed the Lynn Channel. In the blinding snowstorm and the heavy seas, the Princess Sophia was now sailing up to 1.25 miles off course, putting her in a direct collision course with the submerged rocks of Vanderbilt Reef. At low tide, the flat, rocky surface of Vanderbilt Reef rises only about 12 feet or 3.7 meters above the water. But at high tide and in heavy seas, the rocks sit dangerously just below the surface, almost completely invisible. At the time, these hazards were marked only by a single unlit buoy anchored at the south end of the rocks. While the channel was about 6.5 miles wide, the rocks narrowed the main navigation channel to just 2.5 miles on the east side. Unaware that they were sailing dangerously off course, the Sophia plowed forward through the night. With almost no visibility, it came as a complete surprise when at 2:10 a.m., the ship slammed violently into the hidden rocks of the reef. She struck with such force that many of her passengers were thrown from their berths. In the moments immediately after the collision, panic descended over the ship. Everyone dressed as quickly as they could, donned their life preservers, and rushed on deck. Captain Locke ordered the lifeboats readied and swung out over the side in preparation, but the order to abandon the stricken liner never came. As the experienced captain surveyed the situation, it was abundantly clear to him that in the violent storm, no one would survive in the tiny lifeboats. Almost immediately, 20-year-old wireless operator David M. Robinson began sending out distress signals. His messages soon reached Juneau and were passed on to CPR agent Frank Lowell, who immediately began contacting captains in the area. Within an hour, the first rescue craft, a 65-foot gasoline launch, the Estebeth, captained by James P. Davis, left Juneau for the scene of the stranded liner. She would be the first of many. As Captain Locke assessed his ship, the severity of the situation was clear. While the Princess Sophia was not taking on any water, she was lodged firmly on the rocks with little hope of backing off at high tide. The initial panic had long subsided, and by mid-morning when the tide receded, the ship's bottom was lodged around 9 feet above the surface of the water. The Estebeth arrived on the scene at around 11 a.m. By this time, the storm was settling. The snow had stopped, and while the seas were still heavy, they were not so heavy that lifeboats couldn't survive. Captain Davis was even able to row his ship's workboat to within 50 feet of the Princess Sophia. He hailed Captain Locke and asked him if he was going to order an evacuation. Captain Davis would later testify that he felt that while the vessel's position would have made it difficult to lower lifeboats and load them from the reef, it would have been possible with some muscle power from the crew and more able-bodied passengers. Another small vessel of similar size to the Estebeth, the Amy, soon arrived on the scene. Her captain, Edward McDougall, also asked Captain Locke whether he was ready to begin evacuating his passengers. Despite aid from the two vessels, who were able to get relatively close to the stricken liner in calmer weather conditions, Captain Locke refused to allow his passengers to evacuate. He determined that the Sophia was lodged firmly in a crevice on the rocks and that they were in no immediate danger. As the day dragged on, other small vessels arrived on the scene to offer assistance, but by late afternoon the weather once again soon deteriorated, and Captain Locke encouraged the smaller vessels to seek safe anchorage for the night. Complicating the situation, cable communications to Alaska were lost only a few days before. While they had been restored, a rush of messages were making it difficult to organize rescue efforts. Because of this, the 1,341-ton lighthouse tender Cedar did not receive word of the situation until 3 p.m. on the 24th. Commanded by Captain John W. Ledbetter, the Cedar was performing patrol duties for the United States Navy. Being only 66 nautical miles from the scene, she was the largest all-weather vessel in the area. Captain Ledbetter sent a wireless message to Captain Locke to offer assistance. Locke immediately accepted. As the Cedar headed for the stricken liner, Ledbetter asked Locke if it would be possible to evacuate his passengers in the night. Locke responded, "Impossible to get passengers off tonight. Sea running too strong. May get off tomorrow. Strong tide." By the evening, as larger fishing vessels arrived on the scene, the weather grew significantly worse, with strong winds and heavy seas. One of these vessels, the King of Winge, was able to get within 900 feet of the Sophia, but they lacked a wireless set and were unable to make contact with Captain Locke. They could see people moving around the decks of the grounded ship, but with the storm raging, there was little they could do to help. The Cedar arrived on the scene just after 8 p.m., but by this point the storm left them incapable of mounting any rescue effort. Had contact been made with the Cedar earlier in the day, she might have been able to reach the Sophia during those precious few hours of calm when a rescue might have been possible. Now, they had little option but to hope for better conditions in the morning. Snow soon began to fall once again, creating near blizzard conditions. The small flotilla of rescue vessels were forced to seek shelter for the night, leaving the Princess Sophia to fend for herself through the storm. The night of the 24th was a cold and uncomfortable ordeal for the Princess Sophia's unlucky passengers and crew. At 8:30 p.m., one of the boiler's main pipes ruptured, causing the ship's heat and lighting to fail. Some rescue ships on the scene even thought she had been lost when her lights disappeared. It's hard to imagine just what that night would have been like. Without heating, her passenger spaces would be bitterly cold as the snow and wind battered the stricken liner. Those on board probably huddled in their bunks, listening to the howling wind and their steel-hulled trap groaning on the rocks. By this point, they would have been trapped for a full day, and the horrifying ordeal was far from over. Power on the ship was finally restored at 11 a.m. on October 25th, offering the passengers a brief reprieve from the bitter cold and affording wireless operator David Robinson another opportunity to contact the outside world. But the morning offered little reprieve from the harsh conditions. Captain Locke felt that his liner had held up well through the night, and he felt no reason to believe his passengers were in any immediate danger. While the storm raged on, Captain Ledbetter desperately searched for a way to mount a rescue. In the night, he tried to assess the situation with searchlights, and determined that it would be impossible to evacuate by lifeboat. His next idea was to get the Cedar as close to the Princess Sophia as possible and establish a breacher's buoy. This was a desperate solution, with little hope of successfully rescuing the over 300 people trapped on board. After 2 failed attempts to drop anchor, Captain Locke radioed Ledbetter, telling him that it was no use and they would need to wait for conditions to improve at low tide. The Cedar soon departed the scene to retrieve a longer anchor chain. Throughout the morning, Robinson kept contact with the Cedar's wireless operator Elwood Miller. The 2 men were exhausted, Miller working for more than 24 hours at this point, relaying messages, organizing the rescue effort. They lost contact when the Sophia's power again failed at around 2 p.m., and they agreed to contact each other again at 4 p.m. Elwood took the opportunity to finally get some rest, sleeping with his headset on in case his counterpart tried to contact him. 4 p.m. passed without a message from Robinson. Miller assumed Robinson was still resting. Just after sunset, at 4:50 p.m., his headset crackled with a frantic SOS from Robinson. "Ship foundering on reef. Come at once." Miller replied that the Cedar was speeding to their rescue. Robinson's signal was so weak that it could hardly be heard. He radioed another desperate message. "For God's sake, hurry. Water is coming into my room." Miller replied, "We are coming. Save your batteries." Robinson, "All right, but keep talking to me so we will know you are coming." That was the last message received from the Princess Sophia at 5:20 p.m. on October 25th. The Cedar desperately searched the area, but the stranded liner was nowhere to be found in the stormy darkness. What exactly happened in the Sophia's final moments is unknown, but it's clear that she came to a quick and violent end. Watches recovered from her victims all stopped at 5:50 p.m., marking the time they were thrown into the sea. Not a single person on board the Princess Sophia survived. The only survivor was an English setter found in Auk Bay outside Juneau. It's believed that as the tide rose, the ship became partially buoyant, causing her to violently shift over the rocks in the heavy surf, ripping open her hull before washing her into the sea, where she quickly foundered. But many mysteries remain. Robinson's first SOS message was received almost a full hour before the watches on her victims stopped. While most of her passengers had time to don life preservers, the bodies of over 100 victims were found still in their cabin. All 8 of her steel-hulled lifeboats went down with the ship. In the icy water, victims would survive only minutes before succumbing to hypothermia. The next day, the storm died down considerably as the Cedar and other rescue vessels combed the area. When they reached the site, they found only her foremast sticking out of the water. The Princess Sophia was the deadliest maritime accident in the history of British Columbia and Alaska. With no survivors and larger world events to focus on, the Princess Sophia and her victims soon faded from memory. The little we know of what happened on board during those final hours came from her wireless messages and letters found on the bodies of her victims. We have no way of knowing what was passing through Captain Locke's mind during those critical hours after his vessel grounded. It can be assumed that he was well aware that the decision to evacuate could put his passengers in even more danger. He had no way of knowing that those few early hours of calm weather were the best window of opportunity he would ever get. And while it was possible in those hours to mount an evacuation, the steel lifeboats weighed more than a ton each and would have to be lifted off the rocks and into the water, an incredibly difficult and dangerous task. Another potential explanation for his decision came from Captain Ledbetter, who reported a rising barometer. Captain Locke surely would have been monitoring his own barometer and likely assumed that the weather would soon improve. As he looked out at the waves crashing violently on the rocks below, his mind no doubt went to the Clallam disaster, with lifeboats crashing into the sea, hurling helpless women and children to their deaths. His hope and confidence in his ship told him salvation was only moments away. Unfortunately, he was wrong, sealing the fate of everyone on board. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, help out the channel by leaving a like and comment down below. And if you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button for more ocean liner history. And hit that bell to get notified every time I upload a new video. Thank you again to Scentbird for sponsoring this video. You can check them out in the link below. I'd also like to give a special thank you to my patrons for helping make this video possible. If you'd like to help this channel grow, consider joining the Big Ol' Boats crew over at Patreon, where you can get special perks like behind the scenes updates and early access to videos. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Until the next one, be nice to people.